She left convinced of her own clarity, her footsteps echoing with the finality of a decision she believed was not only right, but necessary. In the narrative she constructed for herself, you were the anchor dragging against the hull of her ship, holding her back from the thrilling, uncharted waters she was destined to sail. The reasons she voiced, both to you and to the sympathetic friends who formed her chorus, were a familiar litany. You were too serious. The initial spark had dimmed to a predictable ember. She needed to find herself. These phrases were convenient, socially acceptable containers for a truth far more unsettling, a truth she likely couldn't even articulate to herself. The core of the rupture was not in a single explosive argument or a glaring act of betrayal. It was in a fundamental failure of perception. She existed in a world that glorified noise, constant stimulation, and emotional dramatics. A world that mistook turbulence for passion and stillness for stagnation. Your calm demeanor, which once felt like a safe harbor, began to feel like a cage. Your patience, a profound strength born of self-assurance, was misinterpreted as a lack of passion, a weakness masquerading as virtue. She watched you move through life with a steady, purposeful consistency and labeled it predictability. Unable to see the immense discipline and integrity required to be so reliably grounded, she craved the lightning strike, blind to the profound power of the deep, stable earth beneath her feet. This misreading of your character's essential text allowed her to reframe your virtues as vices. Your logical approach to conflict, where you sought to understand and resolve, felt like emotional detachment to her. She was waiting for a raised voice, a slammed door. A tearful pled the stormy weather that would prove the climate was alive. Your refusal to provide that chaos, your choice to remain centered, felt like indifference. She began to engineer tests, subtle and then not-so-subtle provocations. A sudden coldness, a flirtation hinted at, a critique of your most innate traits. She was probing the walls of your character not to understand their strength, but to find a crack, a flicker of the reactive, chaotic energy that would validate her own inner turmoil. Each test was a conscious choice, though she would have draped it in the language of confusion or following her heart. When she pulled away, she was making a calculation. When she offered silence instead of conversation, she was measuring your response. When she dismissed your efforts as too much or not enough, she was drawing a line in the sand. She hurt you not with the blind swing of a careless hand, but with the precise, repeated cuts of someone who believes they are sculpting a more exciting reality. She confused your forgiveness, offered time and again. For foolishness, a man so desperate to keep her that he had no respect for himself, all the while. She remained oblivious to the man who was actually there. She didn't see the quiet strength it took to hold space for her volatility without being consumed by it. She didn't recognize that your patience was not a passive waiting, but an active, powerful force of choice to believe in the better parts of her, even when they were hidden. Your consistency was not a lack of imagination. It was the bedrock upon which a future could actually be built. You were the steady drumbeat in a symphony she insisted on hearing as a single frantic crescendo. You were not predictable. You were dependable. You were not complacent. You were centered. And so she made the choice to leave, stepping out of the quiet, solid house of your love and into the thrilling, chaotic storm she believed was freedom. She walked away with the confidence of someone who believes they are leaving a prison, completely unaware that they are, in fact, voluntarily leaving a sanctuary. She thought she was breaking chains, not a foundation. She saw a finish line where you had just been patiently laying the groundwork for a marathon. In that moment of her departure, she felt a surge of liberation, a clean break. It was an illusion, of course, but one she clung to fiercely, blind to the fact that the very stillness she was fleeing would one day be the only thing she truly craved. The unraveling was not a sudden snap, but a slow, meticulous fraying. You fought for her long after she had stopped fighting for you, as a soldier on a battlefield where the enemy had already declared a secret peace. You operated on a different timeline, one built on commitment and the stubborn belief that love was a covenant, not a feeling that flickered out with the first strong wind. So you dug in. You listened when she went silent, interpreting her quiet not as a weapon but as a wound. You sat in the uncomfortable stillness, offering your presence as a silent plea. believing that if you were just patient enough, the storm would pass and she would remember the sun. When she pulled away, creating physical and emotional distance, you saw it as a retreat, not a surrender. You held your ground, a steadfast monument to what you had built together, certain she would navigate her way back to you if the landmark remained visible. You believed in her even when she stopped believing in herself. When she spoke in cynical tones about love and futures, dismissing the very dreams you had once woven together, you saw her cynicism as armor, and you loved her enough to believe you could gently help her remove it. You thought that if you were just kind enough, your kindness would act as a beacon. If you were just steady enough, your steadiness would become the foundation she could once again stand on. You were trying to love her back to life, back to you, mistaking her self-destruction for a temporary lostness. But she wasn't lost. She was leaving, and she was using your own virtues as the path. Your patience became the space for her to wander further. Your kindness became a safety net that allowed her to take riskier leaps away from you. Your steadiness was the boring, solid ground from which she could launch herself into more exciting skies. She kept pushing, probing for a limit that did not seem to exist. She crossed lines you never thought you'd have to draw, mistaking your capacity to forgive for an infinite resource. She would watch you absorb the hurt, watch you process the pain, and choose to love her anyway, and in her eyes, this wasn't strength. It was proof of your foolishness. She confused your unwavering heart for a desperate one. There is a profound exhaustion that comes from loving someone who is actively using your love as a whetstone to sharpen their indifference. It is a quiet, soul-deep fatigue that has nothing to do with sleep. You poured your energy into a vessel with a hidden crack, never understanding why it never seemed to fill. You offered reassurance into a void that echoed back only more doubt. You fought for a we that had in her mind already been dissolved. You were a man trying to rebuild a house, while the other resident was secretly setting fires in the rooms you had just repaired. Then one day it happened. Not with a dramatic explosion of anger, not with a tearful ultimatum, but with a quiet internal click. It was the sound of a final piece settling into place, a moment of brutal, unshakable clarity. The shift wasn't from love to hate. It was from hope to acceptance. You accepted that no amount of love from you could fill the emptiness she carried within herself. You accepted that she did not want the peace you offered. She was addicted to the chaos. The fight didn't leave you. It was rendered obsolete. The love didn't vanish. It was rerouted back to its source, back to you. What flooded in to replace the struggle was not anger or a desire for revenge. It was peace. A profound, unnerving peace that felt like the first clear breath after a lifetime of smoke. It was the peace of a man who finally truly sees that he deserves to be chosen, not just settled for. To be seen, not just tolerated. The compulsion to explain, to justify, to make her understand, simply evaporated. You realized that if she couldn't see your worth after all that time, after all you had offered, then another explanation would never make her see it, so you stopped. You stopped arguing. You stopped trying to decode her mixed signals. You stopped offering your heart for her to practice her aim. You simply withdrew. You pulled your energy, your attention, your hope back into the fortress of yourself. And in the space where your efforts, your texts, your reassurances, and your pain used to be, there was now only silence. It was not the cold, punishing silence of a sulk. It was the warm, complete silence of a man who has said all he needs to say and has found his own answer. It was the silence of closure, and you had no idea that this quiet, this peace you had claimed for yourself, would become, in her ears, the loudest and most terrifying sound she would ever hear. The silence you left behind was not the one she was used to. Your previous silences had been heavy with unspoken words, thick with the tension of a fight waiting to happen, or a pain waiting to be soothed. They were silences that begged to be broken, and she had grown accustomed to being the one who held the power to break them. She would wait, and eventually you would return, your love and patience inevitably overcoming the distance she had created. It was a pattern, a dance whose steps she knew by heart. She was confident the music would always start again. So, when your withdrawal came, she mistook it for the opening of a familiar movement. She expected the delayed text, the "can we talk" message, The late-night call, where your voice would be strained with the effort of holding everything together. She prepared for it, mentally rehearsing her responses, the slight coolness she would maintain to keep the upper hand. She assumed you were bluffing, that this was merely a more dramatic performance of the same old play, and that the curtain would soon rise again with you waiting patiently in the wings. Her confidence was a fortress built on the unshakable belief that your love was a constant, a gravitational pull she could always count on to bring you back into her orbit. But the days stretched, and the silence held. It wasn't a tense silence. It was an empty one. It was the silence of a presence that had genuinely vanished. Your digital footprint, once a steady stream of connection, went cold. The spaces you used to occupy in her life, the good morning texts, the check-ins, the shared jokes were now just hollow echoes. This was not a strategic pause. It was a full stop. And that's when the first hairline fracture appeared in her certainty. The game she had been playing had a single, unbreakable rule. It only worked as long as you cared more than she did. For the first time, she was forced to consider that the rule had been broken. Your absence began to mutate from a temporary situation into a permanent state. And in that void, something unsettling began to happen. Your absence became a mirror. It was no longer just an empty space. It was a reflective surface that showed her everything she had refused to see. It reflected the memory of your face, not in anger, but in that final, calm resignation. It reflected the ghost of your efforts, the countless times you had bridged the gaps she had created. The world around her, which she had believed was so full of exciting noise, began to feel thin and insubstantial without the steady bass note of your presence to give it depth, driven by a growing unease. She would find herself scrolling through the archives of your old conversations. She reread messages she had once skimmed or left unread. Now, with the context of your silence, the words transformed. What she had once dismissed as mundane or clingy, now read as profound acts of loyalty. Your hope you have a good day wasn't predictable. It was consistent. Your "I'm here if you need to talk" wasn't weak. It was steadfast. The love, reassurance, and patient effort she had treated as background noise now screamed at her from the screen. And for the first time, an unfamiliar and corrosive emotion began to creep in. Guilt. It was the guilt of realizing she had been given a treasure and had treated it like trash. It was the guilt that arrives in the quiet of the night, accompanied by the memory of how you looked at her with eyes that held not just desire, but a genuine, unwavering belief that she was the one. This triggered a quiet panic, a primal understanding that something fundamental had been lost. She had always believed you were the anchor, the safe, stable, slightly boring weight that held her in place. But now, the anchor had cut its own rope. The stability she had taken for granted was gone, and she was suddenly, terrifyingly adrift. The exciting, chaotic waters she had longed for now felt overwhelming and dangerous. She would go out with friends, laughing a little too loudly. Pogue created photos of her freedom. But behind every filtered smile was a quiet ache, the kind that doesn't fade with the closing of a tab or the end of a night. She was trying to drown out a new and terrifying sound, the deafening roar of your silence and the whispering voice of her own regret. She was realizing too late that she hadn't just left a man. She had abandoned her own harbor. The most terrifying transformation is not the one born of rage, but the one forged in peace. While she was adrift, you were building. The energy you had once poured into the bottomless well of her approval was now redirected, channeled inward with a focus you had forgotten you possessed. This was not a performance for an audience. It was a reclamation for a kingdom of one. The silence she had mistaken for your defeat became the fertile ground where your true self began to germinate, and then to flourish. You started to level up. Not with the frantic energy of someone trying to prove a point, but with the steady, purposeful rhythm of a man who has finally remembered his own blueprint. The gym was no longer a place to work off frustration, but a sanctuary where you rebuilt the temple of your body, each rep a quiet prayer of self-respect. The mornings felt lighter because you were no longer waking up to the weight of her potential drama. The world looked clearer because your vision was no longer clouded by the exhausting task of overthinking someone who had never been sure of you. You began to fill your life with purpose, not as a distraction from the pain, but as an affirmation of a value she had refused to see. You were not becoming colder. You were becoming collected. The chaos she thrived on had been a drain on your system, and without it, your mind became a place of sharp, clean lines and decisive action. And she watched. From the distant shore of the life she had chosen, she watched your metamorphosis through the fractured lens of social media and mutual acquaintances. She saw the new discipline in your posture, the calm assurance in your eyes in a photograph, the quiet achievements you never boasted about, but simply embodied. This was not the man she had left. The man she left was defined by his devotion to her. This new man was defined by his devotion to himself. He was becoming the man every woman would want. And the irony was a bitter pill she had to swallow in the solitude of her new, chaotic freedom. This was the beginning of the haunting. It was not a haunting by a ghost, but by a living, breathing standard. The very traits she had once dismissed as flaws in your logic, your calmness, your unwavering boundaries, now revealed themselves as the bedrock of a strength she desperately craved but could no longer access. Your silence, which she had interpreted as emptiness, now echoed with a depth she could not fathom. Your love, which she had labeled as routine, now stood in stark contrast to the fickle attentions of the men who populated her new world. These men were sparks bright, exciting, and quickly extinguished. They could make her laugh, but they could not make her feel safe. They could offer adrenaline, but they could not offer peace. They competed for attention. You had commanded respect without ever raising your voice. She began to see you everywhere. Not your face in a crowd, but your reflection in the inadequacies of every new connection. A man would check his phone while she was talking, and she would remember how you listened, fully present, your gaze steady and understanding. An argument would spiral into a petty, emotional war. And she would recall with a pang how you would de-escalate your calm, a fortress against her storms. The men she met now were loud about their worth, their ambitions, their possessions. You had been quiet, your worth emanating not from what you had, but from who you were. You were solid when she was unstable. You were patient when she was impulsive. You were real in a world that increasingly felt like it was built on pretending. This realization did not arrive as a single, crushing blow, but as a slow, dripping tap of regret that began to stain every new experience. She didn't just miss you. She missed the woman she was when she was with you. That version of herself felt seen, secure, and valued. She didn't have to perform or contort herself to fit an expectation. With you, she could simply be. Now, she felt the constant pressure to be interesting, fun, and desirable for men who offered only temporary validation. The freedom she had fought for had become its own prison. And you had become the ghost in every room, the silent benchmark by which all others were measured and found profoundly lacking. She had traded a foundation for a series of fleeting moments, and the hollowness of that trade was now her constant companion. You had become her lesson, and the curriculum was a lifetime of comparison. The final stage was not vengeance, but a quiet, unshakable transcendence. The journey that began with a painful severance culminated in a state of being so grounded, so self-possessed, that the past lost its power to wound. You had not simply moved on. You had metabolized the experience, turning the poison of her actions into the protein of your own character. You came to a profound understanding. Her departure was not a punishment levied by the universe, but a form of protection. She was removed from your path not to break you, but to break you open, revealing the man who had been waiting inside all along, buried under the weight of trying to earn a love that was never meant to be earned. This was the Great Awakening. You stopped looking at relationships as a source of completion and began to see them as a potential complement to an already whole life. The desperate chase for connection was replaced by a magnetic attraction to alignment. You learned to stop chasing potential in people and start recognizing patterns. The red flags you once painted green with hope now registered as the bright warning signals they were. You no longer fell for poetic words or intense, fleeting emotions. You were drawn to the quiet hum of a congruent energy, to the peace that radiates from someone who, like you, has made peace with themselves. You had lived through manipulation, emotional instability, and the silent betrayal of taken-for-granted love. And you had survived it all by mastering the most powerful skill of all, the ability to stay still and let the storm pass. That cultivated stillness became your greatest strength. A quiet power that made chaos calm down simply by being in its presence. You became emotionally bulletproof. Not through a callousing of the heart, but through a mastery of its currents. You no longer reacted from a place of old wounding. You responded from a place of present moment clarity. You stopped chasing what fled from you and became a magnet for what was meant for you. You no longer felt the need to explain your worth, for you simply embodied it. This evolution was the final, unassailable chapter of her story in your life. But it was only the beginning of yours. She, in her parallel existence, was left to live with a quiet, persistent ache that does not scream, but lingers in the background of a life, a low-frequency hum of regret. It's the kind of pain that doesn't keep her awake every night, but that sneaks up on her during the calm, unguarded moments. When she sees a couple walking together, not speaking, but existing in comfortable silence. When she hears your name in passing, a casual mention that sends a jolt through her system. When she stumbles upon an old photograph or a forgotten message that still smells faintly of a hope she herself extinguished. She will scroll through your profile, telling herself it's mere curiosity. But the harder truth to swallow is that she remains emotionally tied to a man who has long since outgrown the orbit of her world. You became the living symbol of everything she failed to understand about love. That its highest form is not excitement or control, but profound peace and unwavering presence. And from her new distance, she is forced to watch you, realizing with a sinking finality that she was never truly replaced. She was released. A man does not replace one woman with another. He simply heals from the one who hurt him and evolves beyond the frequency she operated on. Your story in the end is not one of heartbreak, but of rebirth. You rose from what broke you, not with bitterness, but with a calm that unnerves those who are still attached to drama. You learn that true strength is not loud or aggressive. It is found in the profound power of restraint, the deep wisdom of patience, and the unshakable force of consistency. You carry this hard-won wisdom into every facet of your life, your work, your friendships, your deepest purpose. And as you continue to build, life begins to reward you with a peace so deep it makes you grateful for the very pain that once kept you awake at night. You can look back now and see it with crystal clarity. She didn't destroy you. She revealed you. Her leaving didn't break your heart. It broke your illusions. And what emerged from the ashes of that heartbreak wasn't a colder, harder man. It was a wiser, more complete one. Someday, she may gather the courage to reach out one last time, a tentative message, a lingering glance, a silence heavy with everything left unsaid. And when that moment comes, you will not feel anger or triumph. You will feel a genuine, untethered peace. You won't need her apology or her audible regret. Her actions and your subsequent growth have already spoken the final words. You will be able to wish her well, sincerely, and then continue moving forward without a backward glance. Because you have reached the ultimate stage of emotional mastery, you no longer seek closure through her suffering. You find it in your own unshakable stillness, and that is the ultimate quiet justice. Not revenge, not validation, but transcendence. You became what she never expected. The man who didn't just survive her leaving, but who thrived precisely because of it. For the rest of her life, every time she hears your name or catches a glimpse of the man you've become, she won't remember the man she left. She will remember the man she could not destroy. And you will have finally remembered yourself. That self-reclamation is the kind of power no heartbreak and no person can ever take from you.